In part one of this series on memory, we learned about episodic and semantic memory, and that episodic memories provide the content for possible storage in the semantic memory system. In this lesson, we'll look at how scientists are understanding this memory processing in the human brain. First, a quick introduction. The surface of the brain is called the cerebral cortex, and it has the four lobes, the frontal lobe and parietal lobe, occipital lobe, and temporal lobe. Now, underneath the temporal lobe is an important structure called the hippocampus, and it's present on both sides, so underneath the left and the right temporal lobe. And here, what I've done in this picture is I've pulled the hippocampus from underneath the temporal lobe, and here's then the cortex, the cerebral cortex. Here's the temporal lobe, and under the temporal lobe would be the hippocampus. I've pulled it out here. Now, we're going to introduce some icons to represent things in our diagrams. This icon down here will represent the memory trace, the episodic memory trace in the hippocampus. Now, what that means is certain hippocampal neurons responded to the experience and changed synapse strengths so as to store the memory for the episode. And the changes are robust. So the solid lines indicate that these changes are big changes, significant changes in the strengths of the connections between certain hippocampal neurons, and that represents the memory trace for that event. But as well, the cortex was processing the event as well. So here we have the icon for the memory trace in the cortex. Again, certain cortical neurons responded to the experience and changed synapse strengths so as to store the memory for the episode. But as we'll see, scientists think that initially the cortical memory trace is weak. The hippocampal memory trace is strong and the cortical trace is weak. And we'll see the significance then of this in a moment. But first then, the idea of the transformation. Recall that we said that episodic memories can be transformed, providing content for the semantic memory system. So the transformation of an episodic learning episode into semantic memory involves a reorganization of the memory across different brain regions, from hippocampus to cortex. So we want to think of the hippocampal system and the surrounding cortex, the medial temporal lobe. But the hippocampal system is sort of storing the memory trace that would be activated when we retrieve an episodic memory. But that memory is going to be transformed in a way that a semantic memory can be formed from the information that was learned during that episode. And that would be stored in the cortex. So we're going to introduce another icon to show this transformation. Here again we have the sort of the hippocampal system that is important for episodic memories, and then the transformation that the content of that episode can be integrated into semantic memory out here in the cortex. So the hippocampal system is an important system in giving us the capacity for retrieving episodic memories, but the cortex is where semantic memories seem to reside. So semantic memories do not need the hippocampus for their retrieval. And this process of transformation then allows things learned during episodes to be stored in the cortex as semantic memory. Of course, in a school setting, we want to effectively transform episodic learning into long-lasting semantic memories. Being educated means having lots of information in semantic memory, but it got there from episodic memory. So when we go through schooling, we forget the details of every class we go to day after day after day, but hopefully we're going to end up with some information that we have learned, and then we can retrieve that information over long periods of time. Now, scientists have a technical term to describe this transformation of memory, and they call it system consolidation. And we'll define it as the post-encoding reorganization of long-term memory over distributed brain circuits. And the two circuits of relevance here would be the hippocampal system and then the cortex, as we saw in the previous diagrams. So notice in this diagram we have the initial storage of some episode, some learning episode. We're in a classroom learning something. Now the hippocampal system is going to be making a memory trace, an important memory trace. And notice the larger arrow here compared to the one over here to the cortex. A larger arrow indicates that the memory trace is more significant in the hippocampal system. But over time, notice this arrow here with C for consolidation. Over time, the consolidation process, this transformation process, is going to shift the sort of significance of these different brain regions. It's going to change the organization of the memory so that the cortex becomes more relevant for retrieving the information and not the hippocampus. Now, why the brain undergoes this consolidation we'll take up in another lesson, but this system consolidation is this reorganization of memory over these different brain systems, the hippocampal system and then the cortex. We can say system consolidation is the process whereby dynamic interactions between the hippocampus and cortex allow the hippocampus to signal the cortex to store a stronger version of the memory in the long-term memory system. Metaphorically, the hippocampus teaches the cortex to make hippocampal independent memories. Synaptic changes occur in those cortical regions originally activated by the experience. So we want to think of this transformation as involving the transformation of episodic memories into semantic memories. The contents of those learning episodes are going to be stored in the semantic memory system in the cortex. If we can retrieve the details of the learning circumstances, then we will still have episodic memories. But if we forget those, we will at least have semantic memories of the information stored up in the cortex.